Quebec government chooses to overhaul the provincial education system and abolish school boards, as occurred this past week. The Cree School Board is not affected. The early years of Cree School Board were challenging. I was a commissioner for over 7 years. I was there when we had major problems on funding, etc. The Cree School Board inherited 3 school systems that needed to be combined. Government funding was insufficient. There were housing and school facilities shortages. A student population that was growing faster than anticipated. The idea of an Indigenous-controlled school board providing education based on a curriculum that prioritized the Indigenous language and Indigenous values was a revolutionary idea. There were a few models to draw upon. And in those early years, the federal and provincial governments viewed the treaty promises in Section 16 in a narrow and a technical way. They sought to limit funding to the levels that had been provided prior to the signing of the treaty, or to levels that were provided in other non-treaty contexts. They sought to set funding unilaterally without regard for the good faith negotiations requirements in Section 16. It took many years of political and legal battles to win the budgets required to provide the education promised in Section 16 of the treaty. The fact that I started with a black hair and ended up with gray hair should attest to this. That took many years. In its first decades, the Cree School Board focused on building new schools and infrastructure to ensure that children could attend school in their own home communities. These were young leaders who were taken out of their communities, put in residential schools 300 to 700 miles away, and they'll be damned if their own children will be sent from their communities. It is to their credit that they decided, I was part of it, to bring our children home, be with their parents in order to preserve that language, those customs, those values, and be able to share that way of life. In its first decades, today there are preschool, primary, secondary schools in all 9 Cree communities. A majority of the teachers, administrators, and board members are Crees. The board also set up a system of teacher training, curriculum development to enable Cree EU teachers to teach Innu Aimun, the Cree language, to our children with materials that are more appropriate for our history and culture. Today, the Cree School Board provides services in 3 sectors, one devoted to youth education, the preschool, elementary, and secondary education, second to adult education, general and vocational training, and a third supporting the post-secondary students at colleges and universities in Canada and abroad. There are over 4,300 students in the youth sector student population, with hundreds of students in adult and post-secondary education sectors. We still face challenges with respect to graduation and retention rates in our schools, but there is a commitment to addressing these ongoing issues. The driving purpose of the Cree School Board is for our children's education to contribute to their confidence and pride in their Cree language, history, and culture. We're also teaching the skills required for further education and enjoyment. Our approach to education under the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement is based on the principle that every Cree child has the right to learn and be taught his or her mother tongue, and that the promotion and the perpetuation of the Cree language and culture is the root of the Cree education system. While the Cree School Board has an enormously important role in ensuring the preservation and transmission of Cree language to younger generations, this responsibility cannot be shouldered by the educational system alone. The responsibility must also be taken up by the broader community. The Cree Nation's institutions has recognized that all of us have an obligation to ensure that our language and culture are sustained and flourishing. This is why it is important that Cree is used as a primary language of business and government in Cree communities. Cree is spoken by the vast majority of people in Cree communities as their mother tongue before the introduction of French or English. At home, Cree is the first language learned by the vast majority of Cree children. We know that our connection to our lands is reinforced by the Cree language and vice versa. This is how we ensure that Cree is a living language, actively used in our communities, that it continues to shape how we interact with each other in our world. We know, too, that the legacy of residential schools disrupted the transmission of Cree knowledge about the land between generations. The very essence of the Cree language is out on the land. Land-based programs that teach the youth about Cree culture and language are of critical importance for the health of our communities and the survival of our nations. In the language of our hunters, trappers, and our elders who grew up on the land, there is a treasure trove of knowledge about our land and culture. We must renew our efforts to ensure that this treasure is shared and transmitted to the next generation. That is why Cree programs, staff, and elders have worked together to record the Cree terminology about the land. Because younger generations have not had the opportunity to learn many terms in the way that generations before them were able to. These terms have been included in the Cree lexicon publication, which is an important tool for Cree language teachers in bridging the gap between the contemporary and traditional Cree culture. 45 years ago, when negotiating the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, our Cree leaders recognized that to ensure the Cree Nation has tools for exercising our right to self-determination, we must be able to preserve, protect, nurture our language and culture. This lesson continues to guide us today. In 2017, we signed the agreement on Cree Nation governance with Canada. This agreement, the Cree Constitution that accompanies it, set out a comprehensive regime of Cree governance within the lands of our communities. It is more than symbolic that after this governance agreement came into effect, the first piece of legislation that we passed was the Cree Language Act of Inuit. This act sets out a plan to support and promote the use of the Cree language, measure its health, and put in motion ways to reclaim, revitalize, and strengthen it. By adopting this act, we are affirming the central importance of the Cree language for our nation. With our language come essential links to our culture, to our lands, and to our history. Equally, our language provides an essential foundation for our future strength and prosperity. All of these initiatives in support of our Cree language have occurred because we came to the realization in the 1970s, 1980s, that language preservation would be the key to our cultural survival. Of course, we are not alone in this realization. The National Indian Brotherhood, the Assembly of First Nations, among others, have called for Indigenous control over Indigenous education since at least the 1970s. The 1996 report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the 2005 Task Force on Aboriginal Languages and Culture both call for action to urgently arrest further language loss and prevent language degradation. Over the last 30 years, the Cree Nation has participated actively in the development of international conventions relating to Indigenous rights, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also push for Canada to acknowledge and abide by its obligations under international law. We have pressed for these rights nationally and internationally in order to boost the rights in our treaty, to ensure that we may enjoy and practice our cultures, our customs, and our languages, and develop and strengthen our economies and our social and political institutions. The international human rights framework recognizes the importance of protecting and promoting the languages. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples contains several provisions relating to indigenous languages, precisely because of the importance of language in ensuring cultural survival and in achieving self-determination. In particular, the UN Declaration states that indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons, end of quote. It requires that states take effective measures to ensure that these rights are protected. The importance of language and culture is also reflected in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 2015's calls to action, which called on the federal government to acknowledge that constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights include Aboriginal language rights. The TRC called for enactment of an Aboriginal Languages Act and the appointment of an Aboriginal Languages Commissioner. Since the TRC issued its call to action, the Government of Canada has formally endorsed the UN Declaration and committed to the implementation of calls to action. In 2019, it passed the Indigenous Languages Act in response to one of those calls for action. In its 2019 budget, the federal government pledged to invest some $330 million over the next 5 years, with $115.7 million per year ongoing for the implementation of the Indigenous Languages Act. In order to support the Indigenous language revitalization projects, as well as the proposed office of the Commissioner of the Indigenous Languages. It is gratifying to see that over time, language rejuvenation efforts by my nation of Inuit and other Indigenous peoples here and around the world have begun to bear fruit. But there's always more that can be done. In Canada, the colonial legacy of suppression of Indigenous languages has long existed in parallel with robust tradition of protection and support of certain minority language rights. The recognition of French and English minority language rights, now entrenched in Section 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, provides a model upon which to draw for state support of Indigenous languages. Canadians have the right to be educated in their mother tongue, whether French or English. Indigenous children should have the same constitutionally endorsed support. I recognize that in Inuit we are fortunate that the Cree language, Inuit Ayimon, is very much alive in almost 20,000 Crees. It is spoken daily in our homes, taught in our schools, beginning in kindergarten. Many children and adults are able to read and write Cree syllabics. Our community and governments events are conducted in Cree, and Cree is the language of daily business in our communities. We must do all that we can to continue these seemingly ordinary practices and to prioritize language revitalization in our treaties and agreements. Our elders hold the language in their minds and hearts. The youth will be the ones to teach our grandchildren and carry the language forward. Our lands hold and carry us all. To protect our lands is to protect our cultures, languages, and traditions. Our treaties are intended to protect both. As we revitalize our cultures and languages, we strengthen our ability to protect our lands, assert our sovereignty, and exercise our right to self-determination. And as I have said already, this is what modern treaties are all about. And with that, I thank you very much. Mr. Stephen Skumno, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
let him get away with not answering any questions.